All right. Well, hello for everyone. And I'd like to welcome Sarita Steeb from Operation Restoration and Lisa McCann from Georgia Justice Project. Thank you both for joining us. I'm Carl Filler. I'm with the Justice Action Network. I'd first like to congratulate both of you for making progress on several criminal justice reforms this year, particularly the expansion of expungement in Georgia and the movement towards clean slate in Louisiana. I know it's a lot of work ahead, but I really want to congratulate you both for all your great hard work. Today, we're going to be talking about probation and parole reforms, and I'm really excited to highlight both Lisa and Sarita's hard work. And so we're just going to dive right in and have a nice informal conversation about this really important topic. So first, maybe we can start with you, Lisa. So why should we care about probation and parole reform? Are there any stories or data that got you interested in reforming community supervision practices?
Sure, and if you'll pull up the graph that we talked about, this kind of frames the answer in Georgia and really for many places in the country. So community supervision, which is really probation and parole, is the largest part of the correctional system in this country. There are 4.5 million people in the US on probation or parole, which is twice the number of people that are incarcerated in the United States. So Georgia, unfortunately, leads the nation. So why is the Georgia Justice Project heavily involved in this? We do a couple of things. We do direct client service work. We represent individuals, criminal defense in Georgia. So it could be, they could be incarcerated or on probation, parole. And we have seen firsthand how punitive the system is. So we have over 400,000 individuals serving probation or parole in Georgia, which is on a per capita basis, the largest in this country, and on an absolute basis, we're tied with Texas. And some of the reasons for that are we have unlimited probation sentences. Many states cap probation sentences 2 to 5 years. In Georgia, actually just this year, somebody was given 22 years of probation sentence. So this frames why it's such a big problem, and why people should care about it is because, one, I always say it's a humanitarian issue, but if you don't buy off on that, it also affects every single solitary taxpayer, because once somebody is on probation, they are held to a whole long list, 17, in Georgia, 17 general conditions, which they have to meet every month. And then possibly even special conditions. And if you violate, you fail to report a change of address, you fail a drug test, one drug test, you are automatically arrested for a technical violation and put in jail or back in prison. And 25% of all individuals in the prison system in Georgia are there for technical violations. And that is a huge expense to the state. About $200 million a year spent on prison for individuals that have not committed a new offense, but have just technically violated one of these one of a very long list of conditions that we put on individuals. So it's a very punitive system, and it costs a lot of money, and it prevents people from ever re-entering and being successful in life. So that's why everyone should care about it. It's a humanitarian and an economic issue.
And Sarita, from your perspective in Louisiana, I know obviously Louisiana is known for its high incarceration rate, but why should we also care about community supervision in Louisiana?
Well, going back to the chart again that Lisa was just referencing, and if you look at Louisiana, we don't have the same issue as it related to probation, but we definitely have a high rate of individuals that are on parole in the state of Louisiana. And just as she mentioned, really long sentences on we have a tendency that if people got out on a life sentence or something was commuted, that they have a lifetime on parole. So lifetime parole here is something that is actually a thing. and it shouldn't happen. In Louisiana, probation and parole, you can go on inactive parole or inactive probation. So for instance, in my case, my story, I had to do 11 years on parole. 7 of the years I was on parole were inactive, but I still was required to pay the supervision fee every single month. So I still had to pay a $65 supervision fee over the course of 7 years. And I never saw a parole officer in those 7 years. So we have a lot of things that we want to work toward here in the state of Louisiana, because not only does it cost the state money on probation and parole, and it's a burden on the state itself and the finance and resources. It's also a burden on communities and families, because if someone is unemployed or someone doesn't have the means to pay the fees for probation or parole, as Lisa mentioned earlier, here in the state of Louisiana, you could have been violated for not being able to pay. They just recently passed some legislation that says that that is not the case, but that has not stopped them from calling like bill collectors, every single day. And it puts probation and parole in a place where they have to essentially now become bill collectors to hunt down the monies that support their workforce. So a lot of the money that they are calling about and collecting goes directly to salaries. And we know if that's the case, then that is not a level playing field. So here in Louisiana, there are a lot of things that we plan to address as it relates to probation and parole. And some things have been addressed in these last 2 legislative sessions, allowing people to do their visits virtually and online, because a lot of people go out of town and work, and they would have to come back to Louisiana to check in once a month. So we've made some progress, but we still have a long way to go.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a lot of challenges going on right now in both states and in both in parole and probation. So is this a new topic for you all? Has your organization worked on probation or parole reform in previous legislative sessions? And if you have, I mean, how have you sort of framed these in conversations with legislators?
Well, I'll say that, oh, sorry, Sarita.
No, go ahead.
So I'll say in Georgia, Governor Deal, who was our previous governor, criminal justice reform was an issue for him. And he was a 2-term governor, and in those 8 years, he passed 2 very large criminal justice reform bills, and one of them included probation reform, and that went into effect in 2017. So there has been fairly recent, but it's when you start so far in the hole, even if you gain a little ground, we haven't seen a whole lot of change in the last 3 years. So the probation reform that happened was, what they did was they took probation away from the Department of Communications, and they created a new entity, the Department of Community Supervision. And DCS was going to handle all felony probation. And then, unfortunately, private probation companies were going to handle misdemeanor probation. That's a whole nother problem. The Georgia Justice Project, we really work on probation reform for felony probation, because that misdemeanor probation is probation for a year or less, and felony probation that's where the sentences are so egregious and so long. But so they initiated DCS, and they also put into place something called behavioral incentive dates, which was a way for more individuals to get early termination. So fast forward 3 years, and there was a lot of input into that. What they didn't do was they didn't address capping probation, felony probation. Instead, they tried to create a pathway for individuals to get off early. But what we've seen over these past 3 years is it's really not working. And DCS came out with a report just a couple of weeks ago that said over the past 3 years, now there are over 200,000 people serving felony probation in Georgia. Only 213 people have gotten early termination through this new bid process. So what we're working on right now, what our legislation will be for this year, because I don't think there's an appetite with legislators given all the recent reform. But when you start so far in the hole, even though there was reform, it didn't get us very far. We are working on legislation that will expand early termination and make a pathway for every single solitary person that is serving probation to have access to early termination. Since we don't think we can hit let's cap it. It'd be great to cap probation at 2 or 5 years, but given we don't think there's an appetite for that, we do think there's an appetite for creating pathways to early termination, which gets us to the same place.
Right, right. How about you, Sarita? Have you guys worked on this in the past, or?
Yeah, I've worked on it individually as well as with my organization. So with the organization for the last 3 years, we have filed legislation around parole reform. So for the bill that we currently were working on or working toward was Louisiana has this default in their statutes that says that if anyone is rearrested on a new charge and they are currently on parole, that their parole must be ran consecutive to any other new term of imprisonment that they may have, and that it won't be addressed until basically they're finished with their sentence. So what we were finding, a lot of individuals would go and maybe, let's say, commit another crime or be rearrested, and they were in federal prison or in prison in a different state or, somewhere else. And they had served 10 or 15 years, and the state of Louisiana would be there to pick them up on their release date to then deal with their parole violation. And in some cases, it was subjective. It didn't matter how much time they had successfully served on their parole. So one case for me comes up all the time that a young man, he had served 6 years and 11 and a half months on his 7-year parole sentence. The feds indicted him on a new case. He was sentenced to 10 years and his release date is now nearing. He can't participate in any of the, drug programs or anything to get time cut off of his sentence because he has a parole hold, and the state of Louisiana is going to go there, pick him up, deal with the parole violation, and he can be forced to do an additional 7 years because him being rearrested, he didn't get any parole credit time. So in speaking to judges and other individuals, what they told us, they would definitely remember someone whose time they wanted to stack, but they would never remember who they wanted to run concurrently. So if they know that someone is, it's an egregious crime or whatever they see fit, and they feel like they want to stack the time, they're always going to remember to do that, but not necessarily remember to run it concurrent. So the legislation that we filed over the past few years only switches the word consecutive and concurrent in the statute. And then it also addresses that a person should be credited for time served already on parole. So as an organization, that is the legislation that we've been working on. Myself individually, justice reinvestment was something that was started here in Louisiana in 2016. I was appointed to the Justice Reinvestment Oversight Council by the governor. And what that was to oversee the money that was saved during the time that we were reducing the prison population and making sure that the money was being redistributed back into the community. Every year since the legislation has passed in 2017, we've had to fight cutbacks or rollbacks or, the legislature wanting to take away from the progress that was made. So we have been on the defense a lot these last few years around the progress that actually had been made. And then there are some things that they were able to get right. And then there are some things that they keep pushing off as it relates to fines and fees and probation and parole. And the money that they're like, oh, we'll address this in 2019. We'll address it in 2020. We'll address it in 2021. So that's kind of where we are as it relates to the legislative process here in Louisiana.
Yeah,
Sarita,
and so, sorry.
I was going to say, Sarita, we have that same issue here. We haven't addressed it yet, but it seems very inefficient to not address these issues right up front, and why somebody has to serve a sentence, and then you find out, oh, wait a minute, you have a hold from another county, and they, it starts all over again. It makes no sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the challenges, it sounds like, are myriad here. And I think we've done a good job here just talking about some of the efforts that we've all undertaken to get people off supervision early or limit some of those supervision lengths. But we also, and I think you alluded to this early on, Lisa, We know that supervision revocations are a major issue across the country. So what are some of the reasons that you see, and I guess just to clarify for maybe some people who aren't as familiar with this, is that I think we often think when someone has their probation or parole revoked, it's for a new crime or a new offense, but that's often not the case, right? There's a host of reasons that someone can be violated by their parole or probation officer. So what are the reasons that you see? What are some of the causes for folks on supervision, either returning to prison or returning to jail for a probation and parole hearing? And maybe, Sarita, we can start with you this time.
Yeah, here in Louisiana, they have started addressing the technical violation aspect of people returning to prison or jail. In lieu of a technical violation, they have really been trying to work on reducing the caseload on probation and parole around technical violations. So their caseloads have been decreasing. So that is something that they are doing particularly well, and they're focusing on it here. But again, if it's a monetary issue, you're not going to get a probation or parole early, as long as you owe money. And then also here, I think the technical violations that I end up seeing happen more so a lot of times are around like drug addiction and the different things that we are like criminalizing these days, and sticking someone back in prison because of a, drug test or a drug violation, as far as like being addicted to drugs, is not an answer. Like, jail is not rehab. And the thing that is the most problematic here in the state of Louisiana is that it's very subjective. So it's based on who your probation or parole officer is, what a technical violation would look like. We had one woman at the organization that we were working with. She was employed. We had helped her to get a job. She was in our GED clinic going to school. She was on the right track, but her probation officer violated her. And we're like, look, she's on the right track. She's doing the right thing. She's showing up. She's going to work. And he was like, no, she needs to go and spend 5 to 7 days in jail because, and it was something so minor and something so small as her not telling him, I think, about a move or something like that. And that was the response that he gave her. So we had to coordinate with her job to say, listen, we're going to support her. We're going to make sure that she's, back to work in these 5 to 7 days. Can you, do without her? What is it we can do? And really try to hold her life together for like 5 to 7 days. But like, if we weren't, she wasn't a part of our programming or at the organization, she would have lost everything because her probation officer felt like he wanted to teach her a lesson, So the subjectiveness of probation and parole is a very problematic issue.
And so we've talked to, sorry, Lisa, I didn't want to cut you off.
Yeah. Just going to say, I totally agree with Sarita. The subjectivity of it and the lack of transparency is really, really troubling. And there are very, there's, where else does that happen? Probation way back when it first started 100+ years ago, probation officers were volunteers. They were volunteers, and their job was to make sure that individuals, had guardrails for rehabilitation and reentry so they could be successful. And then we have slowly over time, transferred to a very, very punitive system where I think just if I just went on probation tomorrow, I would end up revoking, as I said, there are 17 general conditions that everybody has to meet. And then there could be numerous more special conditions given to each person. And probation officers, they get to decide whether you if you had a technical violation. We're not talking about new offenses, that's different. But no new offense, 25% of people that are in prison are for technical violations. And there should be a graduated system, where we could do a couple things. We could have walk-in hearings as opposed to automatic arrest. We could have a graduated system where you don't pay a fine and fee, or you forget to, report a change of address, or, it's you have to look at it in totality, not, it shouldn't be so punitive that it just keeps people, it literally keeps people, you lose your job, you lose your dignity. It keeps people in poverty. There's plenty of racial discrimination. So there are so many problems with the way it's set up. And it probably starts with subjectivity and transparency, but you can then even dig deeper into it.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like, you know, both in Louisiana and Georgia and elsewhere in the U.S., you know, probation caps, lifetime parole, parole fees, technical violations, discrimination, subjectivity have really played a role in expanding the system. It sounds like from what you're saying, Lisa, well beyond what it was first intended for. So now shifting into sort of the concrete and next year and some of the things that you guys are working on, what are those specific sort of probation or parole reforms that you're planning on pursuing in 2021? Maybe Lisa, we can start with you this time.
Sure, and I'll tell you what we're going to be working on. But you know, we have it's sort of an accordion, right? So there are lots of things that we want to see done. We want to see probation caps. We want to see the elimination of automatic arrest for technical violations. We want to see the limiting of split sentences. But where we think we can really get movement in the legislative session this year is on expanding early termination. And that does give everybody an avenue. Early termination is 3 years in Georgia, and we want to make sure that that everybody has access to that, because all data shows that most recommitting of new offenses happens in the first year. And the commissioner of the DCS, our Department of Community Supervision, has said publicly there are diminishing returns with being on probation after 18 months or 2 years. So I think everybody knows there's not a, early termination would be huge. And so if everybody had access to it. So that's what we're working on, expanding so that everybody has access to it.
Great. How about you, Sarita? What is your organization tackling this upcoming year?
So we're definitely going to still work on the legislation that I mentioned earlier about getting the wording in the statute changed to swap where consecutive and concurrent currently lie, and then also the credit for the time that an individual had served successfully on parole or probation. And the other thing that we're really going to be looking at is the fees for inactive probation or parole, where someone is not being managed or monitored by a probation or parole officer, but they're still required to pay that $65 supervision fee. So that is one of the things that we are going to take to the legislature as well in 2021.
Great. Well, that's very exciting. We'll keep an eye on that. And obviously, if we can be helpful, please let us know. As we're wrapping up here, just want to give you all the opportunity to share some of your lessons learned or wisdom with some of the other states and organizations out there that may be trying to tackle this issue. So do you have any suggestions for them as they work to either craft legislation or advocate for these? Have been there messages or strategies that have worked well for you either in the past or things that you're planning to try in the future?
Yeah, I think for us, we always keep it directly impacted centered. So while we think that you need the research and you need the statistics and you need all of these things, we have direct evidence that a lot of times what changes the minds and hearts of legislatures outside of the fiscal impact is also the stories and the people that they could relate to. So one of the things that we pay really close attention to is we really look at who the makeup of the committees are that we will be testifying in front of, and what those alliances need to be, who needs to be testifying in order for that committee to be able to receive the information. But, with this population of folks who have been incarcerated or who have been affected by the system, society as a whole feels like they know what's best for this demographic. The expertise is not valued. And I think that you have to begin to value the expertise of the people who have the lived experience and that can actually talk about these things in a way where we know we're able to articulate the things that have affected us and how we need to move forward. So I think that it's definitely a situation where you keep your advocacy centered around the folks who have been affected. Also, just to, wrap it up, I think that any organization also should realize and understand that whether the appetite is there or not, you never know what alliances that you will make on certain committees, or what legislator is affected in a particular way that will then become the champion, of your cause. We had one senator on the House 2 years ago when we were working on the removing the box off of college applications, and they were like, he's never voted for anything criminal justice reform related. He's don't even waste your time. But when we got up and we were testifying and in front of the committee, he had a friend of his whose son couldn't get into LSU because he had a weed. And he was like, it's just ridiculous. He's smart, he makes all A's, and he got a weed conviction. And he became someone who talked about our legislation when we were told initially, don't even waste your time, speaking to him or talking to him. So not to get discouraged around what the makeup of the House or the Senate committees are. And, people talk about like, oh, it has to be bipartisan, but I'm sure Lisa can attest to, and we talk about all the time here in Louisiana, like we're almost at a super majority of Republicans in our House, the legislature as a whole. So we have to work across the aisle all the time in order to get anything done. So that would be my advice to organizations.
Yeah, and I totally agree with all of that, and just that the human side of it and the economic side of it, and then I would also just say, to bring in the corporate voice as well, because so many companies have stories themselves of individuals who, great workers who are on probation and had a technical violation and spent 6 days in jail just waiting for a hearing, and then lost their job. So bringing in the corporate voice, I think companies are very supportive of change because it affects so many people. And we all know that, individuals have to thrive for their families to thrive and their communities to thrive and the state to thrive. So bringing in every layer of that, individual, companies, and then the whole state, how it affects the economy is really helpful.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, I'm sure that'll be very helpful for some of our other partners and folks working on these issues elsewhere. So my only last question for you is, what's next after you, eliminated these inactive parole fees in Louisiana and expanded early termination in Georgia? What are you going to tackle next, Lisa?
Well, we do. We have a very large agenda. We are also tackling the automatic suspension of driving license for non-driving offenses, which is a big issue in Georgia, and I think it's a big issue in most states. Loved the talk last week on that you all had. Also looking at expanding record restriction and sealing, expungement. Would love to have a clean slate effort here in Georgia because it's not automatic right now, what we've done. And also looking at child support reform for low-income families. That's near term, and then we have some far term too, but those are all things that we're working on in the near term.
Great. How about you, Sarita?
So here in Louisiana, we do a lot of different things at Operation Restoration. We have like 15 programs. So legislative policy is one of the small programs that we work on. But if we're sticking to the policy lens, some other issues that we have been working on to address on the local level citywide is ending the use of money bail, cash bail in the city of New Orleans, because we also have a bail fund in-house. So we work on that really actively. We address a lot of issues that work toward advancing the rights of primary caretakers, because we know that 80% of women who are currently incarcerated have children that are dependent upon them, either because they're 18 or younger, or they have mental or physical disabilities that require a parent for the rest of their lives. So really trying to figure out a way to get the rights of the primary caretakers at the point of arrest while they're incarcerated. Like, what does that look like to make sure that the relationships with their children are still in the forefront and can be salvaged? Because we know that on the back end, family reunification is something that is very, very hard. We also look at mass incarceration from a public health standpoint and making sure that the legislation that we our drafting and crafting also have a public health lens that we're looking at, through those things. We also work on a lot of education policy work, and removing the barriers that formerly incarcerated folks face when they're trying to access higher education. So, the first step is, yes, of course, removing the box off of the applications. We've worked closely on a federal level to have the Common App remove the question. We're trying to remove the box on the federal level, remove question 23 off of the FAFSA, and really look at how the Office of Correctional Education on the federal level shows up in the prisons in an inconsistent manner, and how we can make that more consistent. So those are some of our other policy work that we are actively working on and focusing on present day.
Great. Well, we will be cheering for you both in this coming year and years in the future on all these great issues. So thank you for both Lisa and Sarita for joining us today. And I hope you enjoy the rest of our Unconventional series. Thank you all.
Thanks.